It was July 1944, and the war was still raging across Europe and the Pacific. But the most important battle of that month happened on no battlefield. It happened inside a secluded luxury hotel in the mountains of New Hampshire. 730 delegates from 44 Allied nations arrived at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods to decide what the monetary order of the post-war world would look like. The entire hotel was booked in secrecy, closed to the public, and the owners paid $300,000 for the loss of business. Boy Scouts ran microphones from speaker to speaker as committees met around the clock. Outside, cities were still burning. Inside, two men were fighting over who would control the money of the entire planet. On one side was John Maynard Keynes, advisor to the British Treasury, arguably the most influential economist alive. Federal Reserve history. On the other side was Harry Dexter White, the chief international economist at the U.S. Treasury, a self-made man who openly chafed at the high-handedness of the aristocratic Keynes. Keynes arrived at Bretton Woods already seriously ill. He would be dead within 2 years. He was brilliant, exhausted, and negotiating from a position of profound weakness. Britain had won the war and lost the century. Keynes had spent years designing a solution, a supranational currency called the Bancor, neutral, belonging to no single nation, used to settle international trade between all countries. This Bancor would not belong to any one country. It would be multinational, neutral, and designed to reduce global imbalances by discouraging both persistent deficits and persistent surpluses. It was, in essence, the idea that no single nation should ever again hold the monetary fate of the world in its hands. The Americans rejected it comprehensively before the conference even formally began, and so the world chose a different path. It chose to trust one country. It chose the dollar. What followed was 80 years of a global monetary system built on a single promise, that the United States would never abuse the privilege it had been handed. In 1971, President Nixon broke that promise in a televised address that lasted 15 minutes. No one voted on it. No one could stop it. And here is the question that should keep every serious investor awake at night. What if there had been a third option on the table in that room in 1944? What if, when Keynes lost and White won, a protocol already existed, one with no issuer, no government, no army, and no president who could appear on television and change the rules? What if Satoshi had released Bitcoin before Bretton Woods? To understand what was really decided at Bretton Woods, you need to understand one number. By 1944, the United States controlled 2/3 of all the gold on the planet. Not half, not a plurality. 2/3. Europe had spent most of its reserves paying America for goods during both world wars. The U.S. had no significant troops on the ground in World War II until 1942, roughly 6 years during which gold flowed steadily westward across the Atlantic. By the time the delegates arrived at that hotel in New Hampshire, the negotiation was already over. You do not negotiate on equal terms with a man who was holding your money. Keynes's Bancor plan, which would have created an automatic recycling mechanism with a notional $26 billion clearing facility, was dead on arrival. The British delegation knew it. Their entire negotiating energy went not into winning, but into limiting how badly they would lose. The plan adopted at Bretton Woods fixed every currency in the world to the US dollar, and the US dollar to gold at $35 per ounce. It sounded elegant. It sounded stable. What it actually was a promise. A promise that the United States would never print more dollars than it had gold to back them. A promise that no single president would ever walk into a television studio and simply dissolve the entire arrangement. The world accepted this promise because it had no choice. The gold was already in Fort Knox. The factories were already in Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania. The aircraft carriers were already in the Pacific. Bretton Woods, for all its rhetoric of multilateral cooperation, was fundamentally a mechanism for transferring monetary hegemony from London to Washington. And here is what every economics textbook leaves out. Keynes did not lose because his idea was wrong. Keynes was denied his experiment not because the Bancor was technically flawed, but because the Americans correctly understood that his system would force the United States, as the world's largest surplus nation, to recycle its trade surpluses or face penalties. In other words, the U.S. rejected a neutral monetary system specifically because neutrality would have cost them their advantage. They did not want a fair system. They wanted their system. And they got it. Now here's the question the delegates never asked, because in 1944, no one could have asked it. What if there was a system that could not be captured by any surplus nation? What if the rules were written not in treaty language that presidents could break, but in mathematics that no government could edit? What if the asset that settled global trade had no issuer, no treasury, no army, and no Fort Knox? That system did not exist in 1944, but the logic that demanded it did. The system built at Bretton Woods lasted exactly 27 years, not because it was poorly designed, because it was built on a promise, and promises have an expiration date. Here is what the world agreed to in 1944. Every currency on the planet would be pegged to the US dollar. The US dollar would be convertible to gold at $35 per ounce. Any country holding dollars could walk up to the window and exchange them for gold. No questions asked. The system worked as long as the United States kept its side of the bargain. For a while they did. But by the mid-1960s, something was happening underneath the surface. The United States was spending far beyond what its gold supply could support. The Vietnam War was bleeding money. Lyndon Johnson's domestic programs were bleeding more. The Federal Reserve kept printing dollars, not because it had gold to back them, but because the economy demanded it. By 1971, there were 4 times as many dollars in circulation as there was gold in the vaults to redeem them. Foreign governments started doing the math. France did the math first. They sent ships to New York to collect their gold. Switzerland followed. Other countries began lining up at the window. The U.S. gold supply started draining fast. On the afternoon of Friday, August 13, 1971, President Nixon gathered his top economic advisors and flew them in secret to Camp David. No State Department officials were invited. No foreign governments were consulted. No allies were warned. Over 2 days, in total secrecy, 15 men decided what would happen to the savings of every person on Earth who held dollars. On the evening of Sunday, August 15th, Nixon appeared on national television. The speech lasted 18 minutes. He called it the Challenge of Peace. In those 18 minutes, he suspended the convertibility of the dollar to gold, effective immediately. The gold window was closed. Foreign governments could no longer exchange their dollars for anything real. The promise, made in 1944, in that hotel in New Hampshire, in front of delegates from 44 nations, was dissolved by one man in one television appearance on a Sunday night when the financial markets were closed. And here is the detail that should make every serious investor stop cold. Nixon called it temporary. The gold window was never reopened. The entire monetary architecture of the post-war world, the IMF, the World Bank, the fixed exchange rate system, the $35 gold peg, was rendered inoperable overnight. Not by a war, not by a democratic vote, not by an international conference, by a television address. Paul Volcker, who was in that room at Camp David, said something years later that deserves to be written on the wall of every central bank on the planet. He said, "Nobody's in charge." That was the honest summary of the system that replaced Bretton Woods, a world where the reserve currency was backed by nothing except the continued willingness of other nations to accept it. A world running on faith. And now you understand exactly why a group of anonymous cryptographers, 38 years later, decided to build something that could never be closed by a Sunday evening speech. Bitcoin was not invented in a vacuum. Bitcoin was the answer to a question that August 15, 1971 made impossible to ignore. The question was simple. What does money look like when you can never trust the man holding the keys? It is October 2008. The world is on fire. Lehman Brothers has just collapsed, the largest bankruptcy in American history. The U.S. government is preparing to spend $700 billion of taxpayer money to bail out the very banks that had engineered the crisis. The Federal Reserve is printing money at a scale that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Every promise that the post-Bretton Woods system had made about discipline, about stability, about the integrity of the financial system was being broken in real time on live television for everyone to see. And somewhere, someone was watching. We do not know who Satoshi Nakamoto is. We do not know if it is 1 person or 10. We do not know which country they were born in, which language they think in, or whether they are still alive. What we know is what they did. On October 31st, 2 to 8, while the bailouts were still being negotiated, while the wreckage of the financial system was still smoldering, Satoshi published a 9-page document. The title was simple: Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. No institution endorsed it, no government approved it, no central bank issued a statement. It was sent to a mailing list of cryptographers, a few dozen people, and most of them thought it would never work. Then on January 3rd, 2009, Satoshi mined the first block, the Genesis block. And inside that block, permanently embedded in the code, visible to anyone who knows where to look, is a single line of text. A headline from the Times of London dated that same day. It reads, "Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks." That was not an accident. That was a timestamp. That was a message. Satoshi was not building a payment system. Satoshi was not building a faster version of PayPal. Satoshi was building the answer to a question that had been asked and left unanswered since July 1944. What does money look like when no single person, no single nation, no single president can change the rules? The answer was 21 million units, fixed forever, not by a treaty that could be renegotiated, not by a promise that could be broken on a Sunday night, by mathematics, by code that runs on thousands of computers simultaneously in dozens of countries, with no headquarters, no CEO, no gold window to close. Keynes had imagined the Bancor, a neutral supranational unit of account that belonged to no nation. He lost that argument in 1944 because the United States had the gold and the guns. Satoshi solved the same problem 64 years later, without asking anyone's permission, without needing a conference, without needing 44 nations to agree. The protocol simply worked, and once it worked, no government on Earth could uninvent it. This is the detail that mainstream financial media refuses to sit with. Bitcoin was not born in a vacuum. Bitcoin was born in the exact moment when the Bretton Woods promise, already killed by Nixon in 1971, was shown to be not just dead, but a fraud from the beginning. The bailout of 2008 was not an anomaly. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had always privatized the gains and socialized the losses. A system where the rules could always be rewritten by the people who printed the money. Satoshi read that system clearly and built the exit. Now look at where we are. Not in 1944, not in 1971, not in 2008. Today. In January 2024, the Securities and Exchange Commission approved the first spot Bitcoin ETF in American history. BlackRock, the largest asset manager on Earth, managing $12.5 trillion, launched its Bitcoin ETF called IBIT. It reached $10 billion in assets under management in 7 weeks. The previous record for any ETF in history was held by the gold ETF, which took 2 years to hit that same number. BlackRock's Bitcoin ETF did it 5 times faster than gold. Within less than 2 years, IBIT had accumulated over $80 billion in assets. The fastest any ETF in any asset class had ever reached that milestone in the entire 30-year history of the ETF industry. The men who run the largest pools of capital on Earth, the pension funds, the sovereign wealth funds, the endowments, the insurance companies, are now buying Bitcoin through the most established financial infrastructure in the world. And then, on March 6, 2025, something happened that would have been unthinkable to every delegate in that hotel in New Hampshire 81 years earlier. The President of the United States signed an executive order establishing a strategic Bitcoin reserve. The White House called Bitcoin, and these are their exact words, digital gold. The order directed the Treasury to hold Bitcoin as a permanent reserve asset, not to trade it, not to sell it, to hold it. The same government that in 1971 closed the gold window without warning, unilaterally, secretly, on a Sunday night, is now accumulating a reserve of an asset that no president can ever close the window on. Let that sentence sit for a moment. The United States government is building a reserve of an asset whose rules cannot be changed by the United States government. This is not a small development. This is the most significant monetary signal since Nixon stood in front of a camera and dissolved the promise that 44 nations made in 1944. Because here is what is actually happening underneath the surface of these headlines. The question that Keynes asked in 1944, how do you build a monetary system that no single nation can capture and weaponize, is being answered, not by a treaty, not by an international conference, not by a new institution with a bureaucracy and a governing board and a headquarters in Geneva, by a protocol, by mathematics, by 21 million units that will never become 22 million, no matter who signs what executive order. The irony is almost too sharp to say out loud. The United States, the country that rejected Keynes's neutral monetary system in 1944 precisely because it wanted a system it could control, is now accumulating the one asset in human history that it cannot control. America is buying Bitcoin for the same reason every other nation will eventually buy Bitcoin, because the alternative is being left behind when the rest of the world figures out what sound money actually looks like. We are not at the end of this story. We are at the beginning of the second chapter. The first chapter was the 70-year experiment with the promise, the idea that one nation could be trusted with the monetary sovereignty of the entire planet. That experiment ended on August 15, 1971, in an 18-minute television address. The second chapter is the one being written right now. And if you are watching this video, if you follow this story from that hotel in New Hampshire to that Sunday night speech to that 9-page white paper to that executive order, then you already understand something that most people around you do not. You understand that Bitcoin was not invented. It was discovered. The logic that demanded it existed the moment Harry Dexter White won the argument in 1944. Satoshi just found the answer 64 years later. The question now is not whether this transition happens. The question is whether you are positioned before the rest of the world understands what you already understand. If you made it this far, you see the game. And if you see the game, you know what to do next.